Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we've got part 12 of our Toys and Joys dump truck and pup trailer build. So starting today, I am not going to explain anymore how to cut flat, square pieces of stock. We should already have that one figured out. So this is going to start picking up pace now. We're going to start today's build by heading right over to the bench, and we're going to get into the front fenders of the engine compartment. Well, I have here a photocopy from the plans, and we can see the fender here. We need to make right and left. So we have this section here, and this is our top view. And we can see it's kind of a little odd. This 7/8 inch long section that is straight, this goes onto the cab. And then this is 8.5 degrees, which matches the 8.5 degrees that we did for our engine compartment. Guys, this is a tricky piece to do here. You can do it in one piece if you want by cutting in here on the 8.5 degrees and then cutting along here. That is completely possible, or you can do it in two pieces. We can see a dotted line here that denotes where this angle here bends. That denotes the corner of that angle. So what we can do for this actually is we can divide this into two parts. So the first thing I want a blank for each one of these fenders that's at least probably 4 1/8 inches long and 1 13/32 wide. That way we have one solid piece. And once we're done that, we're going to lop the 7/8 off of the end to give us two separate pieces. Okay, so I've cut two blanks, or four blanks, I guess. This one here, I've numbered number 2, and I've placed marks to show me which pieces go together. The X's are mating surfaces. Same with this one here, that's marked number 1, mating surfaces with an X, and then a few lines here to show me what side goes together. That way you don't get confused. Now, what these represent are these pieces right here. So we have this one here cut at 7/8, and this one here, this is actually cut at 3 1/8. And the pieces are a little wide here. They're the proper length. We can see that here from the pattern. They're the proper length. They are the proper height to get all of our shaping done in this one piece, but they're still a little wide. So the very first thing we're going to do the easy part first, and that is we're going to cut these pieces here down to 15/16 of an inch wide. And we can just do that at the table saw. And there is our first step done. Now, one thing I'd like to point out, because these are all cut from the same block of wood, when we glue them together, the grains are going to line up, and it's going to make for a much nicer glue joint. So that's something to keep in mind. So I've turned this upside down, as you can probably tell. So this one here, this fender, is actually now representative of this side, the driver's side of the truck. And we now need to cut this 8.5 degree angle, both here and here. Again, we're going to do this at the table saw using a tapering jig. Now, guys, this, in my opinion, is going to be the safest way to cut these blocks. If you don't have a tapering jig, my suggestion to you would be to mark your 8.5 degrees, use a bandsaw to cut just outside the line, and then carefully sand up to that line in order to finish it off. I wouldn't try to cut that angle on this small of a piece without a tapering jig. And with those cuts done, we're just going to test this against the body of our truck. So we're going to hold it up here and just make sure that the angles are correct. And they are. Everything here looks good. So what's the next step? The next step, guys, is we're going to take these two pieces just like this, keeping our angles the same and these corners here lined up, and we're going to glue them together. We're going to clamp them up tightly and let them completely dry. Don't touch them again until they're 100% dry. There's other stuff we can do while we're waiting. Well, these blanks are now dry, and if we look here on the prints, we can see there's this flat surface that is 1 5/8 of an inch above the bottom of our block, for lack of a better term. And all I've done is taken this over to the table saw, carefully marked it out, and I have cut that flat surface. There's no sense in messing around here trying to cut that perfectly straight line with a scroll saw or a band saw. You can do this on the table saw using your miter fence very easily and very safely. So while I was waiting for these to dry, I made myself a marking template. You've seen me do it on this build several times. I'm a big fan of marking templates. And all we're going to do is I'm going to line up the bottom of this fender here with that cut, and then with this bottom corner here. And we're going to trace this out on both the left and the right fender. And this will give us the shape that we need to cut this at. Now, I'm going to carefully cut this over at the scroll saw just outside the lines, and then sand up to the lines at the belt sander for the convex curves and at the oscillating drum for the concave. However, this angle here is going to cause us some problems. So hopefully you saved your offcut. And what we can do is we can use double-sided tape, and we're just going to tape this offcut onto our piece. That is going to level this out so that we get a square cut here and around the perimeter, and as well some square sanding. Once you're done the sanding, you get the fender shape the way that you want it. We can just pop this scrap off of here and move on. But there you go. That's how we're going to get the square lines for shaping this. So let's get this cut, shaped, and test fit on our truck. Well, I know that I said I was going to do all the shaping of this, but I forgot about this 1/4 inch radius roundover that goes all the way around the top end of the fender. Now, guys, if you're not sure of the radius of your router bit, of your roundover, you can use a piece of dowel to check. The drawing says a 1/4 inch radius, so that means that the diameter would be 1/2 inch. It's double the radius. So you can place a 1/2 inch dowel right there in the round part of your router bit, and that will determine whether or not you have the right one installed. If the profile of the dowel matches the profile of the router bit, that is a 1/4 inch radius. So there you go. There's a good way to check your router bits. All right, and with those roundovers done, we can now cut the concave curve here of our fenders, and then we'll finish up the sanding over at the oscillating drum sander. And it doesn't take long before you have your 2 fenders made. Now, guys, I just want to point something out. Here is the joint right here. You can see it underneath in the bottom side of the fender, but because we used the same piece of stock and paid attention to the alignment, look at this right here. You can see the grain lines. They're seamless right across. We have really managed to hide that glue joint, and this looks like it's all one piece. It's nothing but an illusion because there's actually a joint right here. They're both like it. They both show the grain lines very clearly there, and they look great. So pay attention to the alignment of your pieces. We can just test fit this one here to see how it's going to line up, and it will go just like this. That fits very nicely. Aligns beautifully here with the edge of the truck at that 8.5 degrees, and it aligns really nicely down here with the edge of our cab. But there's more pieces to make, and that's what we're going to work on. And we're going to start with another difficult piece, which is this fender base that we need to make a right and a left. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get some 3/8 of an inch stock, and we're going to cut it to be a little larger than what we need. Once we get our square blank cut, we're going to cut that taper that we can see right here. It's actually an 8.5 degree taper. It is the exact same one that is with the engine compartment and with the fenders. They all have to meet, guys. They all have to join up, and we're going to cut those using our taper jig. Well, with that 8.5 degree angle cut, we now need to mark the other angles that are on this piece. And once again, the best way is with a marking template. We're going to need a left and a right. So I'm just going to line this up here against a flat, straight edge to make sure that the back surface of the template mates up, and I will trace this out in order to get the profile that we need to cut. Now, turn the template over, and that will produce the ability to do the opposite side. And again, we're going to line it up with that straight edge, making sure everything is proper, and then we'll trace it out. Now, guys, this is a simple cut. We're just going to cut this. You can do it on the bandsaw. You can do it on the scroll saw. I'm going to do this on the scroll saw, and what I'm going to end up doing is just sanding up to the line afterwards to get our final piece. And once it's all said and done, you end up with something that looks like this. Now, there's still a little more to do here. We have a roundover on this front edge here. We can see it here on the print. That's a 5/16 radius roundover. And we're just going to do this over at the router table. But guys, please, I cannot stress this enough. Do not try to hold this with your hands. That's a fool's game. Get some hand screw clamps in there, whatever you can use, some quick grips, anything to hold this rather than your fingers. It's a small piece, it's a finicky piece, and if the router wants to take it, let the router have it. Don't let your fingers be a victim of this small routing. With the routing done, we now have to add the taper. We can look right here on the drawing. We can see that it tapers to the front end to a final dimension of 3/16 of an inch thick. Well, that starts at this line right here, and we measured in from this end up 1 9/32, and that is the measurement for the taper. It then gets tapered down to the end. So from this line, we're going to taper it. But how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is use some double-sided tape. We will attach it to a square block of wood to give us more room to work. And then we can carefully take it over to our belt sander and sand that taper. Now, guys, you'll want to make sure that the bottom edge is your square edge, and that 8.5 degree taper is facing up. If you don't have that in that configuration, you're going to get a really, really strange sanding. So let's get these two sanded, and I'll show you what you end up with. Well, we're almost done these pieces, but there is still one more bit to do, and that would be this little radius right here. It should come as no surprise that I have a marking template for that. So we're just going to line this up on the edge of our piece, making sure that we have this in the right position, and then we're going to mark it. However, we are not going to shape it yet, mainly because I want it to match the wheel well perfectly, and if there's any discrepancies between this and the wheel well, it's going to look a little off, and it's going to be a little difficult to make them look perfect. So we're going to mark them, but we're not going to shape them just yet. Instead, what I want to do is align the fender bases up here on my fender, make sure that I'm happy with the alignment and how everything meshes together, and then I'm actually going to glue this on to our fender. So our fender bases and our fenders will be all one piece now. We want to make sure that we have it aligned perfectly where we want it, and we want to make sure that we have it aligned on the inside flat edge. This back edge where our 8.5 degree taper is, this is where we want it to sit flush. We can always sand the outside and shape it at the end, but the back part of it, we need it to be perfectly lined up. So use a flat surface to line that up and glue these pieces together. Well, while we're waiting for the fender bases to dry on the fenders, I want to make the fender trim. And I've made another marking template and marked it out onto some 1/8 inch thick walnut. Now, guys, here's the thing. I want to cut the outside surfaces, the outside convex curves. I do not want to cut the inside curves or the concave curves. I want to cut the outside edges and shape them perfectly all the way along. We're going to cut the concave surfaces, so the lower curves, just outside of the line, and you'll understand that in just a little bit. And at this point, we can take the fender trims and glue them to our fenders and our fender bases. But these edges here, the flat edges and the inside curve, are all cut proud of what they should be. And there's a reason for that, because what we're going to do is we're going to glue this in place, make sure that it is exactly where we want it to be, and then we're going to sand the flat edges here and sand all of this inside curve, including the bit from the fender bases here up at the front. We're going to sand that off, and this way everything is going to mesh together and it's going to be all the exact same profile. It's going to look right, it's going to look professional, and we're going to be happy with it at the end. So let's get these glued up, sand the flat sections, sand the interiors, and then we can move on from there. There we go. And by doing it like this, you can see the results. We've got a really nice alignment here on the bottom. Everything looks fantastic. And if we just line it up here with our truck, look at how fantastic that looks. There we go. All right, so get your other one done like this, and then we can move on. And with both of our fenders done now, we're going to move on to the lower fender mounts and the lower fender mount supports. Now guys, the lower fender mount supports are very easy to make. We're just going to mark it out using the dimensions here on the plans, 1/2 inch wide, 3/4 of an inch long, and we're going to join it together at those points, corner to corner. This does not have to be a precision piece. You can cut this on the scroll saw, you can cut it on the bandsaw. Just get it cut out along the diagonal line. The most important thing is to make sure that the edge of your piece, this section right here along the 3/4 inch and the 1/2 inch long sections, this must be square, because these are the gussets that will hold our lower fender mounts. And for the lower fender mount, again, we've just cut our stock to the size that we require, and using a marking template, go figure, we are going to mark these out and cut them, but we're going to cut them just outside of the lines because we want to shape them according to our fenders. So cut them a little proud so that we can sand them later on. Well, with those pieces made, we're not going to glue them in just yet. They will get glued right here with the gussets being at the front end of our cab. But before we do that, while this is still pretty much a block, we want to drill these 2 holes right here on our door panels. These will be for mounting our mirror frame later on. So all we're going to do for these is we're going to mark it out. We're going to take it over to the drill press, and using a depth stop on our drill press, we will drill 2 3/32 diameter, 1/8 of an inch deep holes wherever we mark it here as it states on the plans. And there you go. That's what you end up with. Now guys, this is some precision drilling up here. Look how close we are to the edges of both this routed edge and the edge of the window frame. So you really want to be careful here with the measuring and make sure that you're right on the money. So now with that being done, we can now sit our truck on its head, and we're going to glue these fender mounts and our gussets in place. So we're just going to do them one at a time, making sure that your curve is facing the front of the vehicle. Don't make the mistake of gluing it on incorrectly. And we'll line up these gussets that are going to hold this in place. And using straight edges and whatever we can to align them, we're going to glue these in place and let them completely dry. Well, I'm still waiting for these brackets to dry up. I'd rather them be completely dry before I put them on the model. So we're going to turn our attention to the hood trim. Now, this calls for a 1/16 thick piece. Guys, this is 3 inches wide, and there's a couple problems with this. Number one, a lot of table saw blades do not go to 3 inches high, so we couldn't cut the 1/16 as an offcut. The other problem is most thickness planers don't go to 1/16. 1/8 is their full depth. So it isn't going to work for us to try and take this in the planer and try to cut it from 1/16 stock. The other problem is cutting 1/16 stock on a scroll saw or a table saw or anything like that is very aggressive. Chances are it's going to break the stock. So what I've done is I've marked out the hood trim very carefully on, it's actually 1/4 inch thick. And then I've cut it out over at the scroll saw. I haven't sanded it or anything. And I've never tried this before for a model build, but we're going to give it a whirl. And while it's kind of a waste of material, what I'm going to do is I'm going to double side tape this down to a flat board with some sacrificial strips on either side. And we're going to run this through the surface planer until this piece here is 1/16 of an inch thick. Once we get that done, I'll show you what to do next with it. Hopefully it survives. Well, on my very last pass, I started to hear that telltale crunching sound of the planer destroying whatever it was putting through it. And luckily, it was just one of our guide strips. So I'm not too concerned. I did manage to get this. I don't know if the camera is going to show it, but this is 1/16 of an inch thick here. At least according to this setup block, it's nice and flush here on the edges, and we have our piece perfectly shaped and perfectly thicknessed with very little effort. And it only cost us a couple pieces of scrap and, of course, 3/16 of our thicker piece here, but I'd rather waste the 3/16 in thickness and get a good looking piece than not. So what we want to do now is there is a tiny radius round over. We can see here on the print. Who in their right mind would ever try to route this? So we're going to sand that by hand. Just round off the edges and take off that sharp edge. Once you get that done, we can glue it to the hood of our truck. Now I'm going to sand this radius while it is still attached to this backboard. Reason for that is it will prevent me from rounding the bottom edge, and I'll be able to get a much better seal on the hood of the truck if the bottom edge is flat. So we're just going to round it off and carry on from there. Now, the other thing I want to point out, guys, is if you have used double-sided tape to hold this down, this is held very securely here. Do not come in cross grain and try to pop it off with a putty knife or something, because you're going to snap it at the grain. Come in long grain, slowly working around and gently prying, and eventually it will release. Take it slow and do not force it, and then you won't break it. So one piece of advice I can give you when gluing up this hood trim, guys, this is 1/16 of an inch thick, and as soon as you apply the water-based wood glue, this really wants to curl up and warp. It's so thin that it has the ability to do that. So all I did was take a scrap of 1/2 inch plywood and cut just a little shy of the size, the exact same shape, and then you can use your clamps on the inside to apply pressure. And with that piece of plywood, that will now apply even pressure all the way around. If you need to get another clamp here, you can do that around the entire body. And then you still have room to get in here and clean up the squeeze out. And it will help to prevent it from warping. So just something to keep in mind. So we have our lower fender mounts installed with the gables to hold them securely in place. And I'm just going to take one of my sanding blocks And we're just going to clean this up a little bit. You don't want to sand too much though, because you don't want to take away the shape. And then we're going to do a bit of a dry fit. All right, we can see that really looks good there. I'm seeing this gap. Can you see that? Is it showing here on the camera? It's a little bit of a gap. We've got a 1/16 inch spacer here, which is what the plans call for. I've got this aligned, but there is a gap there. I don't really like it. And if I look at the print right here, it actually shows that gap. So, you know what? I think I'm going to deviate a little bit from the plan, and I'm going to put a small little block of cherry onto each one of these sections, just a small little one, just to fill in that gap, because I really don't like the way that looks. And you can do that with these plans. If there's something you don't like, of course, change it, modify it. All right, so we're going to get this glued together for now. We can glue our cab carefully to our engine compartment. We can glue our fenders in place. And then what we're going to do after that is we're going to get into the shaping of this interior section here that we left a little bit proud. And unfortunately, that's about all the time that we have for this week's show. A lot of great progress made, a lot of difficult pieces, some really challenging parts that you really got to think about the process. So if there's another method that you can think of that, I didn't do, by all means, give it a try. But think the whole process through from start to finish and sort of picture it in your mind. If I cut this angle, is it going to make another cut go strange or on a weird angle? If I don't drill this hole now or I drill it later, is it going to affect things? So you want to keep that in mind all the way through making the model, the whole process. Don't just look at the part and say, okay, I'm going to start with this. Really think through your pieces and think through the process that you want to use in order to make it. Guys, if you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We have an amazing audience base here on the show, and I'm hoping that you're going to consider becoming a part of that. I want to thank you so much for tuning in this week, guys. I hope you've enjoyed the content. We're really steaming along now. This thing's actually starting to look like a truck. So we're doing well. We're going to continue on next week, and I hope you're going to join me for that when I bring you yet another woodworking video.